adventure. Alright, you guys, I'm going to take you through the third adventure for the Bundle of Horror 2. This is available on my website, thearcanelibrary.com. You can either get just this adventure, or you could get the Bundle of Horror 2, which is 4 adventures for the price of 3. But they're all horror adventures. And this one in particular is for 7th level characters. And I'm going to take you through it. So, the Curse of Wardenwood. What's happening in this adventure? You might tell by the spooky hut on the front that there's some forest spookiness going on. So, the background here. The characters are traveling through the deep forest when this adventure starts. That could be for any reason you can choose. I didn't want to force a reason on your particular adventure, but there are probably deep forests somewhere in your campaign world, I hope, and so you can throw this adventure at your characters once the time is right. So what's going on here is there is a village in the deep forest called Wardenwood, and unfortunately it suffers from a very cursed existence. It has a werewolf that has been prowling around its perimeter for some time. And what's more is this werewolf is a new kind of werewolf that I created for this adventure called a progenitor werewolf. And I actually created 4 new creatures for this adventure, and I had so much fun making these ones. So this progenitor werewolf is a more powerful werewolf right here. And it can create wolf children, which are sort of children who gain lycanthropy, werewolf lycanthropy, but are not fully fledged werewolves yet. And what's more is that a progenitor werewolf does not necessarily have to be evil. They're more of a primal force of nature rather than a force of evil. So they're not always evil, but in this case, this particular progenitor werewolf is. So she's prowling around the forest outside of Wardenwood, and her presence eventually drew a wheeled hag to her, which is another new creature I created for this adventure. It's a hag that is a CR 10 combatant. I had so much fun making this hag. She has lair actions and legendary actions, and she's very powerful. And she, like all wheeled hags, enjoy suffering. It's where she gets her nourishment and happiness from. So the presence of this werewolf outside Wardenwood drew her. And she struck up a agreement with this werewolf, which is, you infect the children of Wardenwood with lycanthropy and allow me to enjoy and be enriched by their suffering, and then I will let you have these children as your new wolf pack once I'm done with them. And so this is how the adventure background takes place. Now, what's more, Drusilla, the wheeled hag, has convinced the villagers of Wardenwood that she's actually a good person. She's disguised herself, and she offers to take the children who have been inflicted with lycanthropy and keep them safe during the full moon during the time of their transformations. So the villagers actually bring their children to her, and she locks them up in her basement, ostensibly to keep them from hurting themselves or each other when they're transformed, but also so that she can cause suffering upon them and enjoy their suffering. So the kids are not having a great time during this adventure, and it's up to heroes to save them from this terrible mess. So the adventure begins while the characters are traveling through the forest, and our first encounter here is Root Beasts Rise. Now, Root Beasts are the 4th and final creature that I created for this adventure, and they're sort of the minions of a wheeled hag. They're these viney, nasty, mindless sort of plant beasts that wheeled hags can create by spitting on a mass of vines and moss in the same spot for 30 days in a row. So the Root Beasts rise. The characters are traveling through the forest, and just as they come within sight of this little hut right here, Root Beasts rise up around them and attack out of the moss and the vines on the forest floor. So what's going on here is these Root Beasts are not really a match for the characters, at least not in this quantity. They're more of a ruse. And Drusilla, the wheeled hag, will come running out very early into this combat, really before the characters are able to just obliterate the Root Beasts and sort of shoo them away with fire. And the Root Beasts are her guardians, but against really powerful foes, they're a way for Drusilla to ingratiate herself. And so she comes out in the form of a half-elven woman, and essentially tries to ingratiate herself by scaring off these creatures with a burning handful of sage. And so she invites the characters into her hut to treat their wounds or to provide them something in thanks for fighting these terrible beasts. She's posing as an herbalist, so she may offer them herbs or like healing tinctures of something of that kind. Her real plan is to poison them and imprison them in her basement, because she's like, wow, here's a group of powerful adventurers who I could completely abuse and get a lot of joy out of. So she invites them into her hut. Whether or not the characters choose to go, they'll probably be skeptical of her, especially knowing this is a horror adventure and she's out in this like hut in the woods. So one thing you can do to pull the characters in is that the character with the highest passive perception automatically hears the distant scream of a child from inside the hut. Hopefully that will draw the characters towards the hut one way or another. And that moves us right into the next encounter here, the hut and the hag. Drusilla is going to try to poison the characters into unconsciousness. So there will only be a brief time in which she might be a trustworthy person to the characters, if at all. They'll probably be suspicious of her from the start, knowing the way people are, the way D&D players are. But this is eventually going to, turn into a combat with Drusilla. So once Drusilla realizes she either cannot poison or capture all the characters, which is extraordinarily unlikely, or once they discover that she's not who she says she is going to transform into her hag self and misty step out into the forested area outside of her hut and begin a much more interesting combat than merely the root beasts. So if any of her root beasts survive, they do join this combat, but this is a solo fight against Drusilla. She has lair actions, legendary actions. She's a very adept spellcaster. She can do all kinds of nasty things. So I wrote a pretty comprehensive combat section for her, explaining round by round for the first 3 or so rounds sort of how she will take best advantage of her many abilities. And so the characters will hopefully triumph against her eventually. And when they do so, her hut shrivels and becomes ancient and 100 years old and dilapidated, and the children she has locked in her basement, you can see them through the floorboards. So the characters will hopefully then jump to the rescue and go down and free these children. And the children, there are a variety of NPCs in this adventure, between children and then later on villagers. And the structure of this adventure is extremely fluid. There's no particular set order of locations and events, and many of the battles could happen in different locations throughout this adventure. So I tried to provide a fair amount of guidance about that and give you the tools to generate NPCs as needed rather than make you a bazillion NPC blocks. So I actually have an appendix in here of NPC generators for the 12 children, if you happen to need 12, all 12 become unique personalities, and also for a variety of villagers who the characters might encounter. So lean on that when you need to create an NPC that matches with this adventure. And so it is at this point that the characters are given the adventure hooks, the appeals to reward heroism or discovery as they try to rescue these innocent children who are not evil. If characters cast Detect Evil on them, all of these wolf children are chaotic neutral. They're not truly evil. They're not fully fledged werewolves. They may never become truly evil werewolves. And they're also not really aware of why they're here. They just know they've been naughty and that their parents made them come here. And so the children can answer honestly that they're not sure what they've done and why they have to be here, and they also do not know, they have no memory of what happens while they're transformed as werewolves, and they're not aware that they're werewolves. So once the characters have encountered these children, they'll have to decide what to do with them. The children ask to be taken back to their village of Wardenwood, which is probably the most likely course of events. The characters might decide, hey, it's too dangerous, there's creepy stuff in the forest, we're gonna bunker down here at this hut. In either case, the next encounter is called Terror in the Trees. And it's a series of 3 events that happen. They do not need to happen in order, although taking them in order is perfectly fine. And this is things that happen with the children over the course of the next 2 hours. So the werewolf is the progenitor werewolf. She's lurking around the forest this whole time. And her name is Victoria, and she's going to try to collect these children to her. So during these 3 events, the characters will hear like a chilling howl nearby, and they'll need to make a wisdom saving throw or else be paralyzed with fear for a turn. And then a lot of what the outcomes of these events are that children are lured off into the forest. So like 1d4 children suddenly are snatched away from the back of the line, or suddenly turn up missing because they wandered outside when the characters turned their backs. So the characters could potentially lose up to all of the children, although that's unlikely, either while they're trying to stay in the dilapidated hut or while they're traveling to the village of Wardenwood. That will have ramifications later on then. So the next encounter is a cold welcome. If the characters go to Wardenwood, this is the encounter that happens when they get there. If they have the children with them, the villagers are horrified because the villagers are like, the full moon's rising and these kids are werewolves. And so this is perhaps the plot reveal, the twist where the characters realize the children that they've been rescuing are extremely dangerous foes who are soon to transform. The characters can try to calm the villagers down and work with them. There's a role-playing challenge here. And if they succeed in partnering with the villagers and calming them down, then the children will be less crazy when they transform. Fewer of them will break free, and fewer of them will be threats at the beginning of the upcoming combat. If the PCs fail to sort of negotiate with and form an alliance with the villagers, then the children are really, the villagers are not going to be able to, I guess, restrain the children successfully, and so the children are going to be running rampant during the next fight. So finally, the final showdown here is the light of the moon, and this is when Victoria, the progenitor werewolf, finally makes her presence known. And so there's a map of the village square here, where she's most likely to attack, but if the characters stayed in the woods or stayed near Drusilla's hut, that could also take place at the same map location. So the final fight against Victoria is a tough one. She herself is a very dangerous foe. Progenitor werewolves are extremely fast and mobile. They can move and then dash on their same turn. It's built into their actions. So I laid out some pretty good sort of combat suggestions because the progenitor werewolves are a bit of a complex foe. So the children begin to transform into wolf children during this final battle, and the characters can either subdue them or try to use charisma persuasion to maybe call upon former bonds formed with these children to make them realize what's happening and stop fighting for a moment. So either case, whatever happens in that final fight, there's a sidebar that helps explain where the children are and how many break free each round, depending on all of the past things leading up to this moment. So if the children are restrained, here's what happens. If the children are unrestrained, here's what happens. If the children are in their homes, here's what happens. And if the children are still either in the root cellar or the villagers were able to restrain them as a team, here's what happens. Lots of potential outcomes there. Once that final fight is decided, then you will move on to the aftermath, which talks about, what happens if most of the children were rescued, maybe knocked unconscious, what happens if some of the children were lost, and then finally some future adventure hooks leading out of this one where the characters may have contracted lycanthropy themselves. They may decide to hunt down Victoria, the progenitor werewolf, if she escaped. If any of the children escaped, they may go after them. So there's a few fun things there. And that's the final bit about this adventure. 4 new creatures that I had a ton of fun making. I in particular think that the Wheeled Hag was so much fun and I think is going to be a really fun monster to use in combat against your characters. So definitely scope that one out. And if you check this adventure out, let me know what you think. I'd love to hear it. And I hope you guys enjoy it. All right, thanks so much for watching. Happy gaming!